Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said when Natalie Hayes walked past him in the hallway. Just a nurse. He didn't know she'd performed emergency field triage under mortar fire in Ramadi. He didn't know her call sign was Valkyrie 6. He didn't know the folded flag in her locker carried the weight of a man named Sergeant Chen who'd bled out in her hands at 02 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning. They were wrong. All of them. And what happened when the Pentagon's assignment intersected with her own son's commanding officer would change everything. The third floor of St. Michael's pediatric oncology wing hummed with the white noise of machines keeping children alive. Natalie Hayes moved through it like a ghost, her navy scrubs institutional and unremarkable, her badge clipped to her collar with the photograph of a woman nobody would remember 5 minutes after passing in the hallway. 8 months she'd been working this floor. 8 months of med carts, for lines, vitals charting, and the careful construction of a life that wasn't quite true. She pushed the medication cart down the corridor, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the tile. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of artificial noon. Antiseptic hung in the air like a veil, underlaid with something else, fear. Hospital fear. The particular smell of parents who'd stopped sleeping and children who understood, on some cellular level, that their bodies had betrayed them. The cart clicked softly as she rolled it into the supply station. Natalie's hands moved through the choreography of pharmaceutical verification, name on the chart, name on the vial, initials on the log. Her hands were steady. They'd learned steadiness the hard way. The scar tissue on her knuckles told stories she would never speak aloud, field sutures improvised with medical tape and gauze under incoming fire, the trembling suppressed by discipline, by mission, by the knowledge that 6 men were counting on her not to shake. She didn't shake anymore. In the break room, she opened her locker. Behind a spare pair of compression socks and a half-empty container of peppermint tea, there was a shadow box no larger than a paperback novel. Inside it lay a folded flag, the fold so precise they could cut glass. The corner bore an embroidered name in thread so fine it was almost invisible, Sergeant Daniel Chen. Below that, a date. And below that, a single word she'd never quite accepted, killed. Natalie touched the flag with 2 fingers. Her thumb traced Chen's name. She didn't close her eyes. Closing your eyes was a luxury, and she'd trained herself out of those years ago. Valkyrie 6. She whispered the call sign into the empty break room. The words landed like stones in still water. Mission still running. She closed the locker and walked back to the ward. The pediatric oncology floor at St. Michael's occupied the entire third wing. 18 beds, each separated by curtains that did nothing to muffle the sounds of children crying or the low-frequency hum of parents trying not to fall apart. The walls were painted in shades meant to suggest hope, pale yellows, soft greens, but they only made the harsh reality sharper. You couldn't paint over the truth of what this place was, a holding pattern between hope and goodbye. Natalie settled into the nurse's station with her charting. Her job was ostensibly straightforward: medication administration, vital monitoring, patient education, the 1,000 small acts of care that kept pediatric patients moving through their protocols. But her real assignment was something else entirely. The Pentagon had been quiet about the specifics. An intelligence officer had met her in a parking garage in Washington, D.C., 8 months ago, before she'd taken this position, and laid out the parameters with the efficiency of someone used to being obeyed. "We have reason to believe someone at St. Michael's is altering treatment protocols for high-value patients," the officer had said. Her name was Commander Torres, and she carried herself like someone who'd made decisions that cost lives. Military families. Command staff. They're receiving experimental protocols without consent, signed off by Dr. Edmund Pierce, the department head. We need someone embedded to document the pattern. Why not use military intelligence? Natalie had asked. Because they know what military intelligence looks like. A pediatric nurse with a legitimate nursing license? They'll never see it coming. Torres had slid a folder across the table. You've got the credentials. You've got the discipline. And your son serves under Webb. That connection makes this real. That connection. The words had settled into Natalie's chest like a stone. General Marcus Webb commanded the 75th Ranger Regiment 2nd Battalion. Her own son, Michael, was a platoon sergeant in Charlie Company, stationed out of Fort Benning. They spoke once a month, his voice crackling through an encrypted line, telling her things he couldn't tell anyone else, the weight of command decisions, the men he'd lost, the 17-year-old private who'd nearly bled out but didn't because Michael had applied the tourniquet at the right angle. They were connected by blood and by service, by the particular understanding that came from knowing what your child was willing to die for. She'd accepted the assignment without hesitation. The assignment was simple in theory. Monitor the ward. Review treatment protocols. Cross-reference them against classified Pentagon parameters. Document anomalies. Maintain cover. Natalie had done harder things in Ramadi. She had performed needle decompression on a sergeant with tension pneumothorax while rounds were still coming in, had held pressure on an abdominal wound while helicopters screamed overhead, had made the decision, 3 times in one deployment, about which casualty got the limited resources and which one didn't. Nursing school was almost relaxing in comparison. What wasn't simple was watching children suffer while maintaining the 1,000-yard stare. A text came through on the ward phone. Natalie checked it from the nurse's station. The message was short: VIP admission 1,400 hours. Pediatric autoimmune. Prep isolation bed 7. She glanced at the clock. 1:44 p.m. The admission would arrive within the hour. Dr. Pierce came through the ward doors at 1:23 p.m., his white coat pristine despite it being mid-afternoon, the coat pressed with the kind of precision that suggested he sent it to a dry cleaner rather than wash it himself. He was handsome in the way that came from privilege and gym membership, jawline that had never missed a meal, hair grayed just enough to suggest authority without age, eyes the color of winter sky and about as warm. He was also absolutely certain of his own correctness in every situation. "Hayes," he said, not looking at her as he passed the nurse's station. It wasn't a greeting. It was acknowledgement of her presence the way you'd acknowledge a piece of hospital equipment. "I need the vancomycin protocol updated for the Patterson child. Double the dosage interval." Natalie looked up from her charting. "Current protocol shows Q6H dosing. That's already aggressive for a 12-year-old with renal function at 68% GFR." Dr. Pierce turned to face her fully. His expression didn't change. It was worse than anger, it was the polite blankness of someone speaking to someone they considered fundamentally beneath them. "I'm aware of the renal function, Ms. Hayes. I ordered the labs. I read the results. I also have a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and 43 years of clinical experience. So when I say double the interval, what I'm saying is update the protocol." The room went quiet. One of the nursing assistants looked up from her desk. The unit secretary's fingers paused over her keyboard. Natalie's jaw clenched once. Twice. Then it loosened. She turned back to her screen without responding. "Thank you," Pierce said to her silence, already turning away. "Always appreciate the compliance. The vancomycin protocol was wrong. The GFR of 68 meant the child's kidneys were barely filtering. Double the dosage interval would cause toxic accumulation. It wasn't a medical decision, it was pharmaceutical negligence written on an order sheet. But Natalie didn't have the authority to refuse orders. She had the authority to chart them, to administer them, to watch the consequences unfold. That was the trap. That was always the trap. She thought about Sergeant Chen. About the field triage decisions that had kept her alive and let others die. About the particular weight of choosing. About the fact that real power came not from the title on your badge but from what you could accomplish when you had nothing left to lose. She updated the protocol as ordered. The admission arrived at 1:41 p.m. exactly. 2 nurses from transport wheeled the isolation bed into room 7, and behind them came the parents, a woman in her 40s with the exhausted grace of someone who'd been holding it together for a very long time, and a man in dress blues with stars on his shoulders that seemed to reflect the fluorescent lights like warnings. General Marcus Webb. Natalie felt her chest tighten. She recognized him from the photograph her son had sent, Michael standing at attention in front of the general during a command ceremony, his uniform perfect, his face the blank mask of military discipline. Webb had his hand on Michael's shoulder. Even in a still photograph, you could see the weight of leadership there. The kind of weight that crushed ordinary people and forged leaders from the rest. She didn't stare. She'd been trained not to stare. Instead, she moved to the supply station and pulled isolation precautions, gown, gloves, mask, the full suite of barrier protection. The child, Daniel, came through on a gurney next. He was pale, thin in the way that came from months of illness, his dark hair cut short, his eyes alert despite everything. He wore hearing aids in both ears, the devices nearly invisible against his skin. Natalie caught his eye for just a moment as they wheeled him past. His expression shifted, not fear, something more like recognition. Like he understood, on some level deeper than words, that this nurse was the type of person who noticed you. Who saw you? Who wouldn't make the mistake of shouting at a deaf child while explaining his treatment? The charge nurse, Betty Chen, no relation to Sergeant Chen, though Natalie had asked, was already setting up the isolation room. Complex autoimmune presentation, Betty said, reading from the admission packet as Natalie helped her organize supplies. Suspected vasculitis. Multiple organ involvement. They ran genetic sequencing at Duke. Nothing conclusive. Natalie absorbed the information while moving through the ritual of room preparation. For stands. Monitoring equipment. The careful arrangement of everything a critically ill child might need within arm's reach. She thought about the Pentagon parameters Torres had given her. Genetic sequencing. That meant they were looking at something rare. Something that could be used as a test case. Something experimental. He's deaf? Betty asked. She wasn't being cruel. Betty had worked peds for 15 years and asked about everything. How long? Congenital, Natalie said. She didn't know this, but her voice suggested she'd read it somewhere. Confidence was a kind of currency in hospitals. Use it efficiently. He'll need visual communication markers. No overhead pages in the room. Betty nodded. She understood. And that small understanding, that Natalie had already thought about the child's specific needs, meant that Betty would trust her. Trust was useful. Trust meant access. Trust meant that when Natalie needed to review the detailed treatment protocols, nobody would question why she was reading them. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway at 2:15 p.m., already reviewing the digital chart on his tablet. He looked at Daniel Webb the way a mechanic looks at an engine problem, with technical interest and nothing else. Genetic vasculitis, he said, though he was speaking to no one in particular. Rare. High mortality without intervention. I'm going to recommend we start the experimental protocol. Triple agent immunosuppression with the new agent, Ventixumab. General Webb stepped forward. He wasn't tall, but he filled the room anyway. What's the clinical trial status? Phase 2, Pierce said. Pending Phase 3 approval, but the early results are exceptional. And in a case like your son's, exceptional is what we're looking for. The general's wife put her arm around her son's shoulder. Daniel was watching the doctor's lips, his head tilted slightly, reading the words, processing them, understanding that they meant something important about his body, about his future, about whether he'd leave this hospital on his own feet or not. Natalie began the isolation checklist, her movements precise and practiced. But her mind was elsewhere. Ventixumab. Phase 2 experimental protocol. Being offered to a 4-star general's child without, it seemed, the kind of informed consent documentation the Pentagon would require. This was why she was here. She caught Pierce's eye for just a moment as he turned to leave the room. He looked at her with the kind of blankness that suggested he'd already forgotten her name. I'll get the labs processed, Natalie said quietly. And I'll monitor closely for adverse reactions. Pierce nodded without responding, already moving on to the next task, the next patient, the next problem that required his superior expertise. Daniel watched him go, then looked back at Natalie. He signed something with one hand, a gesture she almost understood but not quite. She would learn ASL. She would need to communicate with this child. She would need to be the one person in this hospital who understood what it meant to be voiceless in a place where your life depended on being heard. Natalie smiled and signed back the only phrase she knew with any confidence. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. "You're safe." The boy looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, like he understood something deeper than the words. Like he understood that this nurse had seen things. Like he understood that she would keep him safe even if it meant becoming someone else entirely. She turned back to her charting and began documenting everything. The treatment protocols. The experimental agent. The consent process. The general's presence. All of it would go into a secure encrypted file that Torres would receive at midnight. The investigation was live. Dr. Pierce conducted grand rounds like he was performing surgery on the hospital's ego. 8 residents trailed behind him in pressed white coats, clipboards clutched like prayer books, their faces arranged in expressions of reverent attention as he moved through the pediatric oncology wing at St. Michael's. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent 20 years teaching people to worship hierarchy, confident, theatrical, designed to echo down corridors. Natalie finished updating Daniel Webb's chart at the nurse's station, her notes methodical and precise, documented medication interactions, potential immunosuppressant alternatives, the precise timing of his last allergy panel. She'd learned to write like a soldier on reconnaissance, every detail mattered, nothing was wasted. Every word could be pulled from a file later. Pierce stopped at her station. He didn't ask. He simply extended his hand, and the chart appeared in his grip like it had transferred through some invisible power he possessed. His eyes scanned her notes for exactly 7 seconds. The smile that appeared was the kind apex predators wear before they strike. "Fascinating," he said, loud enough for the residents to hear. He read aloud, savoring each word. "Nurse Hayes suggests we consider alternative immunosuppressant protocols due to the patient's documented sensitivities." He lowered the chart and looked up at her, eyebrows raised in exaggerated astonishment. "Tell me, Nurse Hayes, did you complete your residency at Johns Hopkins, or did you just binge-watch House?" The resident snickered on cue. Their laughter sounded like applause for something Natalie hadn't done. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Pierce began circling her station like he was surveying territory he'd already conquered. "This is a cautionary example of what I call Florence Nightingale syndrome. When nurses mistake proximity to medicine for actual medical expertise." He gestured broadly, speaking to the residents now, not to her. Proximity is not competence. Observation is not qualification. Stick to vitals and bedpans, The residents laughed again. Pierce glanced at Natalie one final time, gauging her reaction, and when her face remained perfectly flat, carved from marble, her eyes locked on his with the kind of cold stare that comes from having already seen the worst this world can offer, his smile widened. He'd broken something. He was sure of it. He hadn't. 2 hours later, after Natalie had finished her shift documentation and was walking toward the vending machine on the 2nd floor where the good coffee was supposedly kept, Pierce found her in the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the kind of mechanical desperation that filled hospitals at dusk. He leaned against the machine, blocking her path, his presence filling the narrow space like smoke. "You know what your problem is, Nightingale," he said, and his voice had shifted now, no longer performing for residents, just for her. Somehow that was worse. "You think 8 months of changing sheets makes you qualify to question my treatment plans." He stepped closer. "Nurses who think their doctors usually just watch too much TV. Question my protocols again, and I'll have security escort you out in front of the entire staff." He was smiling, waiting, actually waiting, for her to flinch, to crack, to show him that his words had landed somewhere inside her where it counted. Natalie listened to his entire performance. Her jaw clenched once, almost imperceptibly. She let the silence stretch between them for exactly 3 seconds. In Ramadi, under fire, 3 seconds was an eternity. It was the time between breathing and not breathing. It was the time between a decision and its consequence. When she finally spoke, her voice came out like a scalpel, precise, measured, cold enough to drop the temperature in the corridor by 10 degrees. The difference between us, Dr. Pierce, is that I've actually had to choose who lives and who dies. When resources run out, you just choose which conferences to attend. She turned on her heel and walked away. Her limp was barely noticeable. Her hands were steady. She didn't look back. The silence that followed her departure lasted so long that Pierce was still standing there, mouth slightly open, when she disappeared around the corner toward the locker room. His face had gone from flushed to pale in the span of a single sentence. He'd expected fear. He'd expected deference. What he'd gotten instead was something far more dangerous, absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that came from someone who'd already faced down situations that would have liquefied his spine. By the end of shift, Natalie overheard two nurses whispering near the supply closet as she was leaving. Their voices dropped when they saw her, but she caught fragments, falsified credentials, possibly stealing medication. Pierce had said something about her personnel file. One of the nurses, Sarah, who'd always been friendly during breaks, couldn't make eye contact when Natalie passed. She looked away like guilt was contagious. The night charge nurse did the same thing a few minutes later, suddenly absorbed in a computer screen that clearly held nothing important. Pierce had begun his systematic retaliation with the efficiency of someone who understood institutional power like a general understood terrain. He didn't scream or bluster. He didn't confront her directly again. Instead, he made phone calls from his office with the door closed. He planted doubts in the minds of people who mattered, people who controlled schedules, who managed credentials, who signed off on background checks. He was building a narrative, brick by brick, the kind of narrative that was hard to disprove because it was so perfectly constructed. A nurse who was too competent. A nurse who asked too many questions. A nurse who maybe didn't have the right credentials after all. Maybe she'd lied on her application. Maybe she had access issues. Maybe, and here's where he really twisted the knife, maybe she was diverting medication for personal use. That wasn't the worst part. What made it worse was that nobody questioned it directly. They just became distant. Guardians of institutional power don't need proof when they have suspicion. Suspicion is enough. Suspicion plants itself like a seed and grows into something that looks indistinguishable from truth. Natalie catalogued it all for her encrypted file. The rumors. The cold shoulders. The way the 4 teams started double-checking her work with exaggerated care. The way attending physicians began reviewing her patient notes with what could only be described as hostile scrutiny. She was building a case file on Dr. Pierce's behavior, documenting every move, every calculated slight. The Pentagon needed evidence. She was gathering it like ordnance, careful and methodical, each interaction logged and dated and filed away. But as night fell across Savannah, as the city's lights reflected off the Savannah River 16 blocks away, as nurses changed shifts and monitors beat their mechanical rhythms through the corridors of St. Michael's, something shifted in the observation. Pierce had moved from public humiliation into something more dangerous. He'd moved into the territory of institutional sabotage. He was using the hospital's own machinery against her, policies and procedures and the slow, grinding wheels of administrative doubt. He wasn't just trying to break her anymore. He was trying to dismantle her credibility, brick by brick, until nobody in this hospital would believe her if she warned them about a fire in the building. What he didn't understand was that credibility, for someone like Captain Natalie Hayes, wasn't something fragile that could be destroyed by rumors. It was something she'd built in places much more hostile than this. It was built in Ramadi. It was built in the field. It was built in the kind of decisions that kept people alive when everything said they should be dead. But it was also something she kept hidden. Carefully. Deliberately. The way soldiers keep their true nature concealed until the moment it absolutely matters. The way she'd hidden her rank, her service, her history, all of it locked away like weapons she wouldn't deploy until the tactical moment was perfect. She returned to her locker, opened the door to the small metal space that held her civilian life, and there it was, a small shadow box with a folded flag. Sergeant Chen's flag. Chen had been her team medic in the 160th SAW detachment. He'd been laughing at something she'd said when the IED detonated. The flag was all that came home. She pressed her hand against the cool glass and let the weight of it anchor her. This was the reminder. This was the why. This was what real stakes looked like. Not careers. Not hospital politics. Lives. People who trusted her to bring them home and didn't make it. This was why she could stand there in a vending machine corridor and let Dr. Pierce think he'd broken something when in reality she'd already done harder things before breakfast. This was why his rumors meant nothing. Because true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And the world wasn't watching Dr. Pierce yet. But it would be. She closed the locker door, heard it click shut with the finality of a weapon being secured, and walked out into the savannah evening where the humidity sat heavy as a physical weight and the sound of distant sirens echoed between buildings like a promise. The tablet screen glowed in the hospital's fluorescent wash as Natalie pulled up Daniel Webb's allergy panel from her personal device, careful to use her own encrypted connection rather than the hospital system. 20 seconds of scrolling. The results were there: iodine sensitivity, documented 3 days ago at intake. Clear as daylight. She'd watched the phlebotomist label the sample herself. Iodinated contrast dye. That was the killer. That was what Pierce wanted to push into Daniel's veins as part of his experimental protocol. The boy's own body would turn against him the moment that contrast entered his bloodstream. She cross-referenced the intake paperwork on her phone, the official hospital scan of Daniel's signed consent forms. Testing completed, results filed, patient and parent notified. Everything documented. Everything proper. Then she pulled up the hospital medical record system. Allergy panel section, blank. No results. No documentation. No flag. The testing order appeared in the system. The test itself had evaporated. Natalie's jaw tightened. Not deleted by accident. Deleted by someone with access to the permanent record. Someone with administrative override. Someone like a department head who'd spent 23 years building relationships with IT directors and nursing supervisors. The kind of deletion that left no paper trail, no timestamp, no audit log. The kind only a surgeon with institutional backing could execute. She closed the tablet and slipped it back into her locker, her movements economical and unhurried. The machine memory took over, the same careful deliberation that had carried her through 17 months in Ramadi, standing in a casualty collection point with 3 severely wounded Marines and ammunition for only 2 field kits. You don't panic. You catalogue. You decide. You move. Daniel crashed at 2:11 in the afternoon, during a routine saline infusion meant to prepare his body for Pierce's protocol. Natalie was on the 2nd floor doing vitals in the general medicine ward when the overhead system crackled. Code blue, pediatric ICU. Code blue, pediatric ICU. All hands. She didn't think. She ran. The pediatric hallway was motion and noise when she arrived, the crash cart already positioned, nurses moving in practiced patterns, and Pierce standing at the bedside with a stethoscope around his neck, his face composed but his movements sharp with adrenaline. Daniel's small frame was rigid on the bed, his neck swelling visibly, his chest heaving against the restrictions of his own physiological response. His lips had begun to purple. The monitors screamed their electronic panic. Anaphylaxis, Pierce barked. Get me 0.3 of epi, IM. The medication was already in motion, already being drawn, but Natalie could see what Pierce could not or would not see. The boy's chest wall was moving but the air wasn't coming in. His ribs were pulling at angles that meant his body was fighting to move oxygen that had nowhere to go. His airway was swelling shut. Not from the medication. From something in the saline itself. The crash cart bagging began, one of the newer nurses, competent but young, ventilating Daniel with mechanical force. Pump the bag. Push air. Pump again. The problem was that she was pushing air into a closed system. Daniel's lung compliance was failing. Pressure building. Nowhere for it to go. 20 seconds of bagging. 30. His O2 is dropping, someone called out. Sats at 88. Natalie moved past the perimeter of medical staff, her hands already reaching for the crash cart's equipment drawer. She knew what came next because her hands had known it before her mind caught up. The tremor in Daniel's chest was not cardiac. It was mechanical. It was pressure. It was a lung that had begun to collapse because air was pumping in but had nowhere to escape to. Tension pneumothorax. The bagging had created it. She pulled the 14-gauge needle. One movement. No hesitation. What are you doing? Pierce's voice was ice. The interspace. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Daniel's small chest was perfect anatomy. She could count the ribs, find the landmarks, execute the procedure with the same precision she'd used on Lance Corporal Reeves in a convoy just outside Fallujah when a roadside IED had collapsed his right lung and killed his driver. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of a dozen field operations. She found the space. She felt the give of the intercostal muscle. She pushed. The hiss of air escaping. Like releasing pressure from a hydraulic system. Like a confession. Step back, Natalie said. Her voice was different now. Lower. Not a request. The needle was in. The air was rushing out through the cannula in a visible stream. Daniel's color was already changing. His oxygen saturation climbed, 71. 76, 82. His chest began to relax, the frantic muscle spasms quieting as the pressure inside his thorax equalized. 88, the monitor called. 92 and climbing. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning of what happened next. Pierce stepped backward. He didn't shout. He didn't bluster or threaten or make a scene in front of the entire crash team. He simply stepped away from the bedside, walked out of the ICU, and pulled his phone from his pocket before he'd even cleared the double doors. Natalie heard his voice in the hallway, calm and measured as a man ordering coffee. We have a liability issue with Hayes. Need her rotated off pediatrics immediately. Pause. No, I don't think we need to wait. She's a liability. Another pause, shorter. Within the hour is fine. The second call came 90 seconds later, this time to someone higher in the hospital hierarchy. She caught fragments, dangerous improvisation, practicing medicine without a license, performed a procedure she's not qualified for. His voice never wavered. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been human. This was institutional precision. By the time Daniel's breathing had stabilized and a proper chest X-ray confirmed the needle placement, an email had arrived in Natalie's hospital account. Reassignment effective immediately. General medicine, second floor, different nursing team. No pediatric wing access. Her badge, the RFID card that had opened those doors for the past 8 months, would no longer function in the pediatric corridor. She tested it while the crash team was still working, swiped it at the secure entrance. Access denied. The supervisor found her in the hallway. Margaret Chen, a woman Natalie respected, who'd given her a warm smile on her first day. Now Margaret's face was apologetic and careful. I have to give you this, Margaret said, and handed her a printed document on hospital letterhead. Written warning. Citation for practicing medicine without a license. Performing procedures beyond scope of practice. Endangering patient safety through unauthorized interventions. The language was precise. Careful. Unassailable. Natalie's hands held the paper steady. Her breathing remained even. She read it once. She didn't read it again. The board needs to review the incident, Margaret continued, the words coming faster now as if she wanted them out of her mouth. It's just protocol. I'm sure it will be fine. You saved his life. Everyone knows that. But that was the problem. Everyone knew. And Pierce had just made sure that knowing it was dangerous. That evening, from her apartment overlooking the river, Natalie's phone buzzed with a message from her Pentagon handler: maintain cover. Do not engage. 8 words. 2 sentences. The entire weight of command structure in a text notification that arrived while her 14-year-old son was at soccer practice and the evening rain was beginning to hammer the windows like a verdict. She sat at her kitchen table with the laptop open to the state nursing board portal. The complaint had been filed 3 hours ago. She could see the reference number assigned, the formal notification that an investigation was underway, the citation for credential falsification and controlled substance theft. The document cited witness statements from at least 4 hospital staff members, people she'd worked alongside, people who'd smiled during shift changes. Pierce had cultivated them like a gardener plants seeds, and they'd grown into an institutional infrastructure designed to bury her. The mission wasn't just compromised. The mission was burning. Daniel Webb lay in the pediatric ICU with a chest tube now properly placed, his airway stabilized, his vitals normalized, alive because of what Natalie had done. But Natalie's access to him was gone. Her clearance to be near him was gone. The investigation was open. Her credentials were under review. And Pierce was standing in the hallway right now, probably making another phone call, probably already rewriting the incident report to say that the needle decompression had been an act of panic, not precision, and an authorized intervention by a nurse who'd exceeded her training. The rain continued. Harder. Relentless. Natalie didn't cry. Captain Hayes didn't cry. But she sat in that kitchen chair in the gathering darkness, looking at her locked-out badge and her son's text asking if he should bring home dinner, and she understood that the Pentagon had just given her an order that meant watching Daniel Webb's care pass entirely into Pierce's hands while maintaining the silence of a ghost. The phone buzzed again, her handler. One message. Package is being processed. 17 hours. 17 hours until what, the message didn't say. 17 hours until Pierce completed whatever protocol he was accelerating. 17 hours until the evidence was secured or destroyed or buried under enough institutional weight that nobody could ever exhume it. 17 hours until the mission either succeeded or failed and Natalie Hayes had to choose between being a nurse and being a soldier, and there was no third option left on the board. The hallway outside Daniel Webb's room was empty at 11:43 in the morning. Dr. Pierce stood against the wall, phone pressed to his ear, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand during a delicate procedure. Not raised. Not angry. Clinical. Methodical. Nursing supervisor? This is Dr. Pierce. I need to file a formal incident report regarding one of your staff members. Natalie Hayes. Yes. I'll wait while you pull her file. He exhaled slowly, as if discussing a simple scheduling conflict rather than dismantling a woman's career. The incident involves falsification of nursing credentials and pattern of dangerous improvisation in patient care. I want her removed from pediatric wing immediately. Today. The second call came 3 minutes later, his finger already scrolling through his phone. Administration. The hospital's legal department didn't answer phones, they answered to people like him. This is Dr. Pierce, Chief of Pediatric Oncology. I'm calling to inform you that we have a compliance issue that needs immediate escalation. One of our nursing staff has presented fraudulent credentials and has been operating outside her scope of practice in a way that directly endangered a child's life. Yes, I have documentation. I'll be forwarding everything within the hour. I want her badge pulled before end of shift. The third call was to the state nursing board. The tone never changed. Professional. Concerned. Devastated by the necessity of it all. Good morning. I'm calling to file a formal complaint against a registered nurse currently employed at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah. The complaint is regarding dangerous improvisation beyond scope of practice and suspected credential fraud. Her name is Natalie Hayes. Yes, I'll spell that. Hayes. He hung up and stood in the hallway for exactly 10 seconds, breathing like a man who had just completed a successful surgery. Then he walked to the administrative office on the 3rd floor and did something far more damaging than yelling. He smiled at the nursing supervisor and said, "I'd like to request a staffing adjustment. Remove Hayes from the pediatric rotation effective immediately. Give her shifts in the outpatient clinic where there's less critical oversight required. I'm concerned about patient safety, but I'm also concerned about her. She's clearly struggling. Maybe a less demanding role would help." Concerned. The word was a scalpel. By 1 p.m., the hospital IT department had received a formal request from administration to restrict electronic access credentials for Natalie Hayes to pediatric wing systems. No explanation needed. Dr. Pierce had already provided it. The restriction was entered into the system at 1:17 p.m. Her badge card would still work on the main doors, but the pediatric wing? The medication dispensary? Daniel Webb's chart? All locked out. Invisible walls, the kind that nobody questions because they appear to be safety protocols. She didn't know yet. She was in the outpatient clinic, transcribing notes on a patient who'd come in for a follow-up visit, when the system gave her an error message. Access denied. Contact IT for credential verification. She tried again. Same message. She didn't call IT. She already understood what had happened. The walls had been built while she was looking at something else. The state nursing board complaint arrived in her email at 4:12 p.m., forwarded by the hospital's legal department. Investigation pending. Credential verification required. The allegations were precise. Falsification of credentials. Operating outside scope of practice. Pattern of dangerous improvisation in patient care. 3 witness statements, all alleging she had misrepresented her qualifications. 2 of them were from nurses who didn't know her well enough to dislike her, which meant Pierce had already begun the rumor campaign. The 3rd was from an aide who hadn't made it past the first week on her unit. Natalie read it in the break room, standing, not sitting. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But the math was already calculating in her mind. The mission had been to document protocol manipulation. To secure evidence of pharmaceutical conspiracy. To protect children. Now the mission was collapsing like a building with its foundation removed. She was the cover. Her presence in the pediatric wing was the lens through which she could see into the machinery. If she was removed, if she was discredited, if her access was restricted, then she couldn't monitor Daniel's care. Couldn't document Pierce's next move. Couldn't prove the conspiracy. And if she revealed her true identity, if she called her command and told them the cover was blown, then the investigation would collapse anyway. The Pentagon liaison would arrive. The operation would be exposed. And Pierce would have 72 hours to delete everything that mattered. 17 hours. The state nursing board said they would complete a preliminary investigation within 17 hours. 17 hours until her credentials were either verified or suspended pending formal review. 17 hours until she was either a nurse or unemployable. 17 hours until Daniel Webb was left in Pierce's care with nobody watching. She didn't cry. Not there. Not with 3 other nurses in the break room pretending not to notice. She folded the email printout and placed it in her pocket and walked back to her assignment without comment. The outpatient clinic. Where there was less critical oversight required. Where she couldn't help anyone. At 2:47 p.m., her supervisor called her into the office. Not the nursing director. The direct supervisor. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. "Natalie, we've received some concerns regarding your credentials. It's purely procedural, but administration has asked us to place you on immediate suspension pending investigation. You'll need to turn in your badge and ID. Security will escort you out. This is standard protocol. Nothing personal. Standard protocol." The words were a closing door. She removed her badge from her neck and placed it on the desk. The laminated card with her name, her license number, her photograph from 8 months ago when she was just a pediatric nurse in Savannah. She removed her ID. She stood. How long will the investigation take? Typically, 3 to 7 business days. But given the nature of the allegations, it could be longer. We'll be in touch. She nodded and walked toward the elevator. 2 security guards flanked her at the main entrance. Pierce had indeed insisted on this detail, because humiliation works better when it's witnessed. They walked through the lobby at 2:51 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon when shift changes brought staff moving in both directions. Some people looked away. Some people stared. One nurse she'd worked with for 4 months made eye contact and then looked at her shoes. That one hurt more than all the rest combined. Pierce watched from the second-floor walkway, arms crossed, satisfied. He didn't smile. Smiling would have been unbecoming. Instead, he turned and walked back to his office where he had already prepared the next phase, 17 emails to hospital administration explaining the situation, each one more professionally concerned than the last. By evening, every senior physician would know that Natalie Hayes had falsified her credentials. By morning, every nurse in the hospital would know it too. She drove home in silence. Her hands were shaking on the wheel, not from fear but from rage so cold it felt like hypothermia. 3 hours until her son came home from school. 3 hours to compose herself. 3 hours to figure out how to explain that his mother wasn't who he thought she was. She parked in the driveway at 4:04 p.m. and sat in the car for 21 minutes before going inside. Her scrubs were still on. Her hair was still pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn through the shift. She'd forgotten to change because she hadn't anticipated being escorted out by security at 2:51 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. The kitchen table was where she ended up. Cold ceramic chair. Hands flat on the wood surface. And then her 14-year-old son came through the back door at 4:15 p.m., home early from soccer practice because the field was flooded, his uniform still damp, his hair matted down, and he stopped moving entirely when he saw her. "Mom? Why are you home?" She couldn't answer. The words existed in languages she'd never spoken in his presence, languages of covert operations and classified assignments and the specialized terminology of people who'd been trained to watch other people die. She couldn't tell him about the uniform hidden in the attic. Couldn't explain the Pentagon liaison or the investigation or the mission that was now in free fall. Couldn't tell him that his commanding officer's son was alone in a hospital without anyone watching the protocols that might kill him. Just a bad day, sweetie. He set his soccer bag down slowly. "Are you okay?" "Fine. Just tired." But he was 14 years old and his mother was sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs at 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, crying quietly, and he'd never seen her cry before. Not when his father left. Not when her sister died. Not in the entire 14 years of his life. She was the stable one. The quiet one. The one who held everything together while other people fell apart. She cried harder because she realized he thought she'd been fired for incompetence. He thought his mother was the kind of nurse who made mistakes. He thought the best thing about her was being exposed as a fraud. He stood in the doorway, terrified and helpless, and she understood that the mission had already cost her something more valuable than evidence. It had cost her 14 years of his certainty that she was capable. The tears came harder. Not sobs. Just tears, silent and steady, the way water runs when a dam has been breached and no one remembers how to rebuild the walls. Outside, the savannah heat pressed against the windows. Inside, the kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her breathing, unsteady now, uncontrolled. Her son stood in the doorway and didn't know what to do because his mother had taught him to be strong and now she was breaking in front of him. And she sat at the table, unable to explain, unable to promise him that everything would be fine, unable to do anything but cry quietly while her mission fell apart in the silence. 2 days later, Natalie's son walked into St. Michael's administrator's office carrying a shadow box. He didn't knock. He didn't introduce himself. He just laid the box on the polished conference table where the termination hearing had convened, his 14-year-old hand steady as surgical steel, and said 4 words that stopped every voice in the room: "Mom, they need to see these." The lid opened like a question nobody wanted answered. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Combat Medical Badge. 3 medals arranged on navy velvet, each one catching the fluorescent light like a confession that had been waiting 7 years to be made. The administrator's mouth went slack. Pierce sat rigid, his face already shifting through shades of something that looked like understanding and panic fighting for dominance. And then the doors opened again, and 4-star General Marcus Webb walked through them. He'd flown in from Fort Bragg 3 hours earlier when he realized Daniel's condition had deteriorated under Pierce's replacement protocols. He'd been briefed on the suspension, the investigation, the accusations against the woman who'd saved his son's life. He looked at the medals. His eyes went to Natalie, still standing against the far wall of the conference room, still in her nursing scrubs, her hands folded in front of her the way a petty officer stands at attention when authority walks in. General Webb went rigid. Not the rigid of shock. The rigid of recognition. Of a soldier seeing a ghost he'd never expected to meet in a hospital building in Georgia. He whispered a single word like a prayer, Valkyrie 6. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when the room's entire understanding of itself collapses. Daniel's Marine Corpsman uncle stood up. He was still in uniform, had been sitting in the back, had said nothing until this moment. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and began to read in the steady voice of a man who'd carried wounded soldiers through hellfire. His words came out like bullets. Captain Natalie Hayes. Rendered aid under direct fire in Ramadi, March 2017. Tension pneumothorax, 2 sucking chest wounds, blast fragmentation wound to the right femur. Captain Hayes performed field decompression and applied occlusive dressing while rounds impacted the structure around her position. Saved 11 men that day. 3 of them command staff. 2 of them standing in this room right now. He lowered the citation. The paper trembled slightly. Not from his hands. From the weight of what it meant. Pierce stood up. His face was crimson now, the color of a man realizing his exit has been blocked. This is irrelevant theater. Her military background has nothing to do with her scope of practice as a nurse. The board's decision stands on professional grounds alone. The hospital IT director, a Navy veteran named Clayton who'd worked in cybersecurity before he took the job managing the hospital systems, pulled out a laptop and opened it on the conference table. His voice was quiet. Which made it worse. Dr. Pierce deleted Daniel Webb's allergy panel results on 7 separate occasions. Here's the timestamp. Here's the deletion log. Here's the restoration backup showing what he removed. Clayton turned the screen toward the room. He also coordinated with Axion Pharmaceuticals to bypass our standard protocol review. 17 saved emails. In one of them, he writes, military families are ideal. Clearance background checks mean minimal legal exposure. The children respond well to the immunosuppressant profile. The pharmaceutical representative appeared on the security footage then, a woman in a grey blazer meeting Pierce in the hospital parking garage at dawn, handing him a manila envelope. The IT director tapped the keys. Bank records show $47,000 in deposits from Axion over 18 months. All matching dates when Pierce altered treatment protocols for VIP patients. Daniel Webb was patient 7 on the list. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish drowning in air. Those treatments were promising. The families were, but his voice had turned to gravel. His hands were shaking now. The hands that hadn't trembled when he'd threatened Natalie's career, when he deleted a child's medical records, when he'd watched a boy's oxygen saturation drop while he refused to admit what he'd done. The administrator stood slowly. She looked directly at Pierce, and the disappointment on her face was the kind that ends professions. You used our patients as test subjects. Pierce's next move was a tell. He reached for his phone. His fingers flew across the screen, and the IT director watched the attempted deletion requests ping his system in real time. Each one logged. Each one timestamped. Each one saved automatically to a secure server that had been locked down since 6 that morning, waiting for exactly this moment. Clayton leaned back in his chair, his voice still quiet. System's been locked down for 6 hours, Doctor. Every deletion attempt you just made was logged and saved. Thanks for confirming your login credentials for the State Medical Board. 2 police officers entered without being called. They didn't rush. They didn't drag. They simply stood on either side of Pierce with the patient efficiency of men who'd done this before, and they said, "Dr. Pierce, we need you to come with us." As they walked him toward the door, the administrator picked up her phone. Medical Board. I need to report a license suspension, pending investigation. Yes. Now. Pause. No, I'll wait. Within the hour, Pierce's medical license was suspended. The pharmaceutical company sent a cease and desist to his personal email and another to their own legal department, already drafting liability shields like a life raft for a sinking ship. The Pentagon liaison who'd arrived with the security footage made 3 phone calls and then turned to Natalie, his voice carrying the weight of classified operations finally declassified. "Captain Hayes, your assignment is complete. Evidence secured. Mission parameters satisfied. Welcome back." The news broke locally first, then nationally. Prominent physician at military-adjacent hospital experimenting on children of deployed personnel. Axion Pharmaceuticals issued a statement distancing themselves from the doctor's actions. The hospital issued a longer statement about their commitment to patient safety. Pierce's wife filed for divorce within 7 days. His country club membership was revoked by Friday. His medical license appeal was denied 3 months later, pending criminal charges that would take another year to resolve. But Natalie was already walking toward the pediatric wing, her shoulder insignia visible now instead of hidden, her voice carrying the weight of authority instead of deference. The nurses parted slightly as she passed them. Not from fear. From recognition. The kind that happens when a soldier walks among civilians and everyone suddenly understands what they've been standing next to all along. Daniel Webb was sitting up in his hospital bed, the correct medications running through his full line now, his autoimmune markers already responding to the proper protocol. He saw Natalie and his face did something that looked like sunrise. He signed, "Thank you." His small hands trembling with the emotion of a 12-year-old who'd almost died and didn't quite understand why the nurse who'd saved him had been sent away. Natalie approached slowly and gently corrected his hand position, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd taught field medicine to soldiers in the sand. Then she signed back the only phrase that mattered, "You're safe now." 3 words in the language of her patient silence. 3 words that meant everything. General Webb stood in the doorway, watching. His own son was overseas now, serving under his command. He'd made a point of that arrangement, wanted the boy protected by proximity to authority. Every letter home mentioned Captain Hayes. Not Nurse Hayes. Captain. The distinction mattered. The hospital administrator stopped by later that afternoon, her voice carrying the tone of a woman rebuilding trust in an institution that had nearly collapsed. "Captain Hayes, we'd like to offer you the position of clinical nurse specialist. Full authority over protocol reviews. Particularly for VIP patients and military families. The position comes with significant pay adjustment and direct access to my office." Natalie accepted with a single nod. The kind of nod that doesn't need words. Pierce's replacement arrived from Johns Hopkins, a soft-spoken pediatric specialist named Dr. Morrison who asked Natalie's opinion on every treatment plan, called her captain when they were alone, treated her like the combat medic she actually was instead of the nurse she'd been pretending to be. The folded flag still sat in Natalie's locker, Sergeant Chen's name visible on the fabric, a reminder of what real stakes looked like. But now it shared space with a photograph, her son in his dress uniform, smiling, safe, breathing the same air as his mother who'd been trained to move through fire. The shadow box containing her medals hung in the pediatric wing hallway now, mounted on the wall beside Daniel's room with a bronze plaque reading, "Captain Natalie Hayes, RN, in recognition of service to those who cannot protect themselves." 6 months later, news came that Dr. Pierce was teaching CPR certification courses at a community college in Jacksonville for $16 an hour. His medical license appeal was still gathering dust. His phone stayed silent. Nobody called him anymore. But in the pediatric wing of St. Michael's in Savannah, a 12-year-old deaf boy was learning ASL from the nurse who'd chosen to save his life instead of preserve her cover. And his mother, The actual protector, the one who'd raised a son strong enough to carry his mother's medals into a room full of power and lay them down like evidence, was back where she belonged, in the spaces between what people could see and what they absolutely needed to understand. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And Natalie Hayes had spent 7 years doing exactly that. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, please subscribe and let me know in the comments. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your stories matter. Share them.